"You should ask her out." Megan Prescott said it at a volume that carried across half the fundraiser. String lights swung over the Savannah river front. Nearby chatter faded away in stages. Adam Reeves went stiff. Traces of sawdust still clung to the folds of his knuckles. On the other side of the walkway, Hannah Prescott turned around. Her wine glass hovered near her mouth, waiting to see if he'd back down. A friend had challenged the single father to take out her CEO sister, and she wasn't joking. Neither of them saw what was coming. The pause stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. Some dares fade from memory within days. Others reshape a life without asking first. Keep going with this one. It doesn't end where you'd guess. Hannah agreed before she could second-guess herself, not for Adam's sake, but because Megan was standing there beaming like she'd just won a bet, and because 30 onlookers wanted to see whether the Prescott sister, who never dated, would finally give in. That's the explanation Hannah told herself on the walk home. It lasted about 2 days. The real reason surfaced later, at 2 in the morning, when sleep wouldn't come, and she made herself face it. For 3 years she'd been surrounded by men who introduced themselves with their surname and their net worth in the same breath. Adam had stood there with sawdust on his hands and barely said a word. Something in that quiet had held her attention longer than an hour of rehearsed small talk ever had. She didn't dwell on that thought. Adam, for his part, knew almost nothing about her. Megan had once mentioned her sister ran some kind of downtown operation, an office, a view, the sort of job that swallowed weekends. He imagined spreadsheets. He imagined someone glancing at her phone under the table. He was wrong about that second part, though it took 3 dates for him to realize it. Their first evening was a walk through the historic district, past old cotton warehouses converted into restaurants, live oaks trailing moss over the street lamps. Hannah wore flats instead of heels, something she never did for work events, and she told herself it didn't mean anything. "You built that," she said, nodding toward a park bench they passed, one Adam had restored for the city the year before. He hadn't mentioned it. She'd read the brass plate bolted to the armrest. "Guilty. It's good work. It's a bench. It's still good work," she said, and meant it. He caught himself staring a second too long before turning to study a shopfront across the street instead. He asked what she did for work. She said something about numbers and other people's headaches and left it at that. He didn't push. Pushing felt like it would cut the evening short, and he wasn't ready for that. Still, he noticed the way her shoulders dropped slightly when she answered, as if the question itself were a weight she was glad to set down for an hour. They talked instead about things that didn't matter and things that did. Her least favorite building downtown, a dog she had wanted as a kid and never got, a wife he mentioned once, gently, without elaborating. Hannah didn't push either. Some things, she understood, needed to be offered rather than pulled out of someone. At home, Ellie was up long past her bedtime, 8 years old and unable to fake otherwise. "Did you kiss her?" she asked, delighted with her nerve. "Ellie, Dad, we had coffee. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." She giggled and let herself be carried off to bed anyway, still smiling. Adam sat on the porch a long while afterward, turning over something he didn't yet have a name for. It wasn't just that Hannah was easy to talk to, it was that she listened like she had nowhere else to be, which in his experience was the rarest thing in Savannah or anywhere. 3 miles away, in a house too large for one person, Hannah poured a glass of wine she never finished and thought about a man who repaired park benches for a living and never once checked his phone. She thought about how long it had been since anyone made her forget, even briefly, that she ran a company of 300 employees, watched over by a board still weighing whether her father's judgment had passed down to her intact. Neither of them brought up the word, date, dare, any of it. They simply kept finding reasons to see each other. A second walk became a third. a carpenter and a woman with a corner office and unnamed headaches, circling something neither had agreed to yet, and neither was rushing to name. The customer walked into the shop on a Tuesday, an older man, Frank Doyle, who'd once hired Adam's old firm for a warehouse retrofit outside Atlanta, back when Adam had blueprints instead of sawdust for a living. Frank didn't know that chapter had closed. He clapped Adam on the shoulder as though 6 years hadn't passed, the bell over the door still swinging shut behind him. "Reeves, didn't expect to find you fixing furniture. Last I heard you were running load calculations for half of Fulton County."
The shop fell into the particular hush workshops get. The table saw ticked as it cooled. Dust hung suspended in the one shaft of afternoon light through the front window. "Different life," Adam said, meaning to end it there, already reaching for a rag. "Shame. What happened over there? Waste of a good engineer." Frank shook his head and moved on to ask about a chair leg he wanted, matched to a set from his grandmother's estate, and Adam let him, relieved the man didn't know more, relieved too that Frank had never learned exactly how that career had ended. Hannah had stopped by with lunch, an excuse, and they both knew it, and had caught just enough from near the door, paper bag still in hand. Engineer, load calculations, a shame. What happened? She wanted to ask. The question sat right behind her teeth the whole time she watched Frank ramble about chair legs, but the set of Adam's jaw told her this wasn't a door he wanted pried open over sandwiches. So she let it go, handed him his lunch, and asked instead about the bench, about anything else, and watched some of the tension leave his shoulders as the conversation drifted somewhere safer. Later, after Frank left with his measurements and a promise to return, Adam caught her studying him across the workbench, and for a moment he nearly said something. Then Ellie called from the back room, needing help finding her shoes, and the moment slipped away the way most of them did that week, there and then gone. That night, at Adam's kitchen table, while he cleaned up after dinner, Ellie told Hannah, unprompted, about her mother, a woman named Claire, who used to hum while cooking and always burned the toast on purpose because Ellie liked it that way, liked picking off the black crusts and eating them first, a game only the two of them knew. Hannah hadn't asked. She simply listened, elbows on the table, and something in her chest softened in a way she wasn't prepared for. She drove home past the old cotton warehouses again, slower than necessary, windows cracked to let in the smell of the river, thinking about a man who used to calculate the loads that kept buildings upright, who now sanded down someone else's dining table for a living, who had a daughter who spoke of her mother as though she were still warm, still nearby, still worth burning toast for. Hannah didn't know what happened to him. She only knew it had cost him something large enough that he still flinched at the memory of it, 5 years on, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, over a chair leg. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she wanted, more than she'd wanted almost anything lately, to be someone he could eventually tell. Across town, in an office with a river view, Roy Dalton scrolled through a supplier list for the Riverwalk Exchange rooftop project and paused on a name in the reclaimed lumber contract, Reeves Restoration. He sat with that for a long moment, thumb hovering over the trackpad, then closed the file, telling himself it was a common enough name, common enough that a man in his position had no reason to think twice. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon before leaving the office that night, which wasn't something he usually did midweek. The dates lost their edge of nervousness. They stopped feeling like something either had been dared into and started feeling like something they'd chosen, quietly, one Saturday at a time. They repaired a park bench together, an actual one this time, a splintered rail down by Forsyth Park the city had been meaning to get to for a year. Hannah showed up in jeans, which surprised him more than the flats had. She held the board steady while he drilled, swore when she pinched her thumb, then laughed at herself for swearing, glancing around as if someone might have overheard a CEO cursing over a 2x4. Adam thought, not for the first time, that he liked her best when she forgot to be careful.
"You're better at this than you should be," he told her, watching her sand a rough edge with more precision than the job called for. "I like things with a clear right answer. You'd be amazed how rare that is in my week." They went fishing on the Wilmington River one gray Sunday, mostly in silence, which suited them both. Hannah caught nothing. Adam caught a small redfish and threw it back, and she teased him the rest of the afternoon. "All that skill, and you just let it go?" Somewhere in that teasing, he realized he'd stopped bracing for the conversation to swing toward jobs and titles, toward the things people usually need to know about each other before they let themselves feel anything. Ellie came along one of those Sundays, thrilled to be included, and spent an hour teaching Hannah to skip stones with the gravity usually reserved for matters of state. Hannah was terrible at it and didn't mind being terrible at it in front of an 8-year-old, something Adam noticed and filed away as the kind of small detail that told him more than any conversation could. She never asked what he used to do. He never asked what exactly ate up her weekends. It wasn't avoidance so much as no particular reason to ask. Fixing a bench or biting a hook didn't require either of them to say more than they wanted to. The gap in what they knew about each other sat there unaddressed, the way a locked door in a house you're only visiting doesn't need explaining. Megan noticed the shift before either of them mentioned it. "You two are disgusting," she told Adam over the phone, not unkindly, in a good way. "Don't overthink it and ruin it." "Who says I'm overthinking?" "You're a single dad who alphabetizes your spice rack. You're always overthinking." He laughed and didn't deny it, and didn't tell her that what kept him up some nights had nothing to do with spices and everything to do with how badly he wanted to tell Hannah things he'd sworn he'd never speak of again, how the wanting had started to outweigh the promise. For her part, Hannah began turning down dinners with men whose names came attached to the right kind of surname, men her mother would have approved of, men who discussed portfolios the way other people discussed the weather, and didn't examine too closely why.
A carpenter with gaps in his sentences had become the person she most looked forward to seeing. The announcement ran in the local paper on a Thursday morning, a rendering attached, a rooftop event space, glass and steel, crowning the old Riverwalk Exchange building down by the water. Grand reopening in 6 weeks. Hannah's name sat front and center on the press release, the first major project she'd led since taking over from her father, the one she'd promised the board would prove she belonged in the chair she'd inherited. Adam saw the poster in a coffee shop window downtown and stopped walking, his coffee going cold in his hand. The Riverwalk Exchange. He knew that building the way a person knows a scar, not by looking at it, but by the ache when something brushes against it. He'd spent 11 months of his old life inside its bones, calculating what its floors could bear and what they couldn't, before someone above him decided his math was inconvenient. The poster carried only the Prescott Group name and logo, nothing about who ran it now, and the 2 facts, the building he'd once tried to save and the woman he was falling for, sat in his mind without touching yet. He told himself it was an old wound reopening, nothing more, a coincidence of geography in a city small enough for coincidences like this. He didn't yet know how right the first half of that was, or how wrong the second half would turn out to be. He folded the flyer into his jacket pocket anyway, the way a person keeps something they aren't ready to face but can't quite throw away either. At the Riverwalk Exchange, Gary Pewitt walked the basement level with a flashlight and clipboard, same as every month. 61 years old, 4 years from a pension he had no intention of losing. He found the crack running along the support wall almost by accident, wider than it had been in March, wider than it should have been at all, the flashlight catching a shadow that hadn't been there before. He crouched, ran a thumb along the seam, felt loose grit come away under his nail. He'd seen a crack like this once before on a job site he tried hard not to think about anymore, and had hoped never to see one again. He didn't write it up that night. He told himself he wanted to check again first, be certain,
And some part of him, the honest part, the part that had worked construction sites for 30 years, knew that wasn't really why he hesitated. He had a pension, he had grandchildren in Pooler he helped put through school. He wasn't eager to be the man who caused trouble on Roy Dalton's rooftop project 6 weeks before opening night, not when retirement was close enough to taste. That evening, Ellie asked her father why he looked sad, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug he'd forgotten to drink from, the poster still folded in his jacket pocket like something he couldn't quite discard. "Just an old building," Adam said, and pulled her into a hug instead of explaining, and she let it go, the way children do, trusting her father would handle it. Adam didn't tell Hannah what he'd recognized in the poster, not yet. He turned it over for 2 days, weighing what saying it aloud might cost, running the same argument in circles until it wore a groove in him. If he told her the truth, that he'd been the engineer on that building, that his name still sat in a file cabinet beside a report someone had buried, she'd ask why he never mentioned it. She'd want the rest, and the rest was a story about being pushed out of his career at the exact moment his wife was sick, a story he'd spent 5 years not telling anyone, including himself, on the nights he still woke up running numbers for a job he no longer had. If he said nothing and the building was fine, no harm done. If he said nothing and it wasn't fine, he'd never forgive himself for staying quiet to protect a few weeks of something good. He sanded the same table leg 3 times that week without noticing, which Ellie pointed out at dinner, and he laughed it off, and she let him, the way she let a lot of things go at 8 years old that she probably shouldn't have. Hannah felt him pulling back before she understood why. He answered slower. He canceled a Wednesday dinner with an excuse that didn't quite hold together, something about a delivery running late that she was fairly sure he'd invented on the spot. She assumed, because it was the nearest assumption, that she'd somehow become too much for him, too complicated, too much overhead disguised as a woman he had feelings for. "If you want to stop this," she said one night on his porch, arms crossed against a cold she was inventing to give her hands something to do, "you can just say so." "That's not it." "Then what is it, Adam?" He nearly told her right there, got as far as, "There's something about that building your company's fixing up," before he stopped himself, because he could hear how it would sound, a man using a relationship to fish for information, exactly the kind of thing that would make her doubt every quiet evening they'd spent together. "Forget it," he said instead. "Long day." She let it go, though it cost her too, and drove home replaying the sentence he hadn't finished, wondering what building he could mean and why it had put that particular look on his face. She nearly turned the car around twice and talked herself out of it both times, telling herself he'd explain when he was ready and that pushing now would only prove she didn't trust him to. That night, instead of calling Hannah back to try to explain what he couldn't yet explain, Adam sat on his porch with his phone in hand a long while before dialing a name he hadn't called in 5 years. Gary Pewitt picked up on the 4th ring. When Adam said his name, there was a long pause before Gary said, "Quiet and rough. I wondered when you'd call." That night, in the records room 3 floors below Roy Dalton's office, Gary stood before a locked cabinet with a key he wasn't supposed to still have, hands unsteady under the buzzing fluorescent light, and pulled a folder untouched in 5 years. He photographed every page with his phone before he let himself think too hard about it, then slid the folder back exactly as he'd found it, straightened the label, and locked the cabinet again, like a man erasing his own footprints.
Gary met Adam the next evening at the workshop, after Ellie had gone to a friend's for dinner, and set the folder on the workbench between them as though it might still be dangerous, as though the paper carried some residual charge after 5 years in a locked drawer. "You were right," Gary said, "about the load transfer on the east wall. I found the calculations." "My calculations?" "Somebody signed off over your objection 2 weeks after you filed it." Adam turned the pages slowly, his own handwriting in the margins, 5 years younger, careful and certain. A signature at the bottom that wasn't his. Roy Dalton's. "He knew," Gary said. He knew, and he buried it. Made sure you were the one who looked unreasonable for making noise about it. I was project foreman then. I should have said something. I had a mortgage and 2 kids in high school, and I told myself it wasn't my fight. Gary's voice cracked on the last word, and he looked down at his own hands like they belonged to someone he wasn't proud of. I kept a copy anyway. Never could bring myself to throw it out. Told myself it was just habit. Wasn't habit. Some part of me always knew this day was coming. Adam sat with that a long moment, the folder heavy in a way that had nothing to do with paperweight. "There's a crack in the east basement wall," Gary said, "wider than it should be. Same wall. I found it a week ago and haven't written it up yet because I've spent 30 years not making trouble and don't know how to start now. 6 weeks before the ribbon cutting. You have to write it up. I know. People are going to be standing on that rooftop." "I know, Adam." Gary looked at him, tired in a way that went past 61 years. "That's why I called you instead of doing it quietly. I needed somebody who'd make me finish this instead of letting myself talk myself out of it again." Adam looked down at his own 5-year-old handwriting, at proof that he'd been right and it had cost him everything anyway, and understood with grim clarity that he wasn't going to get to keep pretending he was just a man who fixed furniture. Not this time. He thought of Hannah and what this would mean for them too once she knew all of it, not just that he'd been an engineer, but which building, which report, and whose name sat on the falsified sign-off sheet 3 floors above her own office. There was no version of telling her the truth that didn't also hand her a war with her own board. He thought of Ellie asleep at her friend's house, trusting the world to be steadier than it was. Then he tucked the report under his arm and drove to Hannah's house because there was no room left for waiting. She opened the door, already reading his face. What happened? He held up the folder instead of answering right away, and something about the gesture, formal, careful, like he was handing over evidence rather than starting a conversation, made her step back and let him in without a word. He told her all of it, sitting at her kitchen table, the parts he'd never told anyone besides Gary and his own late-night thoughts, the load calculations, the report he'd refused to soften, the meeting where Roy Dalton told him his numbers were overly conservative and needed revising before submission, the revision Adam refused to make, the restructuring that eliminated his department 2 weeks later, timed close enough to look accidental and far enough to be deniable. "I used to be an engineer, on this building, your building. Roy signed off on my report. Over it." Hannah sat very still, then reached for the folder and read Roy Dalton's signature herself, 5 years old, perfectly legible, sitting beneath calculations that weren't his, beneath a conclusion that contradicted them. Something in her face shifted as she took in 2 things at once: what Adam had lost and exactly who had taken it. A man who sat 2 seats down from her at every board meeting, a man her father had trusted for 20 years. "You knew this whole time," she said, not an accusation so much as a fact she was still absorbing. "Since the poster. I didn't know it was you running it. I swear to you, Hannah, I didn't put it together until Gary showed me the file with Roy's name on it. I was trying to figure out how to tell you without it sounding like I'd been using you to get close to your company. I know how that looks." She believed him, mostly because of how badly he clearly didn't want it to be true, and mostly because the alternative, a 5-year plan built around a chance meeting Megan had orchestrated on a whim, didn't survive contact with common sense. But belief didn't make the ground beneath her any steadier. She sat awake most of the night, the folder open on her kitchen table, reading the same page over and over until the words stopped rearranging themselves into anything less painful. She called Roy Dalton that same night, and he agreed to meet her at the office at 9 the next morning. When she laid the folder on his desk, his face did something practiced and smooth, a face built for boardrooms. "That's an old, disputed report, Hannah. Reeves was let go over performance issues, not some cover-up. I'd be careful whose word you're taking given the personal nature of your relationship with him. There's a crack in the east basement wall,
widening.
The room went very quiet. Warren looked down at the photograph in his hands for a long moment, then back up at Dalton, and something in his face had already changed. The board voted 7-2 to postpone the opening and fund. Buildings settle, that's not evidence of anything. It's evidence of exactly the failure mode he predicted 5 years ago. Dalton's jaw tightened, the first honest thing his face had done all morning. If you go pulling at this thread in front of the board 6 weeks before we open, you'll hand every competitor in this city a story about the Prescott name and structural failure in the same sentence. Think carefully about what you're willing to burn down here. Your father built this company. You'd be gambling it on a relationship with a man who lost his last job for exactly this kind of stubbornness. Hannah left his office with her hands shaking, not from fear of him, but from the size of the decision now in front of her. She called an emergency board session for that evening and stood at the head of the table with Roy Dalton 3 seats down, watching her with an expression that dared her to blink first. 9 board members sat around the long mahogany table, papers untouched, the river dark through the window behind Hannah's chair, except for the lights of a passing barge. "I'm postponing the reopening," Hannah said, "until we complete an independent structural review of the east wall." "Based on what?" asked Warren, an older man who'd sat on the board since her father's time. "A 5-year-old grievance from a disgruntled former contractor," Dalton said. "Based on a crack our own maintenance team documented last week," Hannah said, and nodded to Gary, who stood at the back of the room in his work uniform, clipboard in hand, more nervous than he'd been in 30 years on job sites. Gary walked them through what he'd found, plainly, in the flat language of a man who'd spent his life around concrete and steel and had no patience left for spin. He passed around dated, time-stamped photographs of the crack running the length of the support wall. A few board members leaned forward without meaning to. Then Adam stood in a shirt that still smelled faintly of sawdust, no matter how many times he'd washed it, and walked the room through calculations 5 years old that never stopped being correct. "This isn't personal history," Adam said, steady, the room's attention settling on him the way it used to in another life. "This is a load-bearing wall carrying more weight than it was ever rated for, with a documented crack that's widening under a rooftop addition. Nobody re-engineered for the new load. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to get an outside engineer in there this week before you put 400 people on that roof for a ribbon cutting." Dalton argued back. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and told the room this was hysteria dressed up as diligence, that Reeves had a 5-year-old grudge and a girlfriend on the board who'd lost her objectivity. "Ask yourselves," he said, "whether you'd be hearing any of this if Hannah weren't seeing this man socially." "Ask yourself," Hannah said, without raising her voice, "why your signature is on a report that overrode his numbers without ever running new ones." Emergency reinforcement. 2 votes belonged to Roy Dalton and a friend from the Finance Committee. Everyone else had seen enough. At home, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with Megan, coloring with the television off, glancing at the door every few minutes. "Is Dad going to be okay?" Ellie asked, crayon paused mid-stroke. Megan, who didn't entirely know the answer herself, told her that her father was doing something brave and that being brave usually took a little longer than being scared. Ellie considered that, then went back to coloring, apparently satisfied, while Megan sat there wishing she felt half as certain as she'd sounded. The independent engineers confirmed everything within 48 hours. The crack ran the full depth of the east wall, exactly as Adam's old calculations predicted, and the rooftop addition would have added roughly 30% more load than the wall could safely bear. Reinforcement began within the week,
Steel bracing, new footings, work that pushed the reopening back nearly 2 months, a delay the local paper covered as a story about the Prescott Group's integrity rather than its failure, which was not the version of events Roy Dalton was counting on. Dalton was suspended from the board the following Monday, pending an internal investigation. His name quietly dropped from the city's Historic Preservation Committee soon after, the kind of fall that happens fast once people stop pretending not to notice. He never called Hannah to argue his case. By then, there was nothing left to argue. Hannah called an all-staff meeting the day the suspension became public. Standing before the same room that had voted, she named Adam Reeves and Gary Pute and told 200 employees the truth, that a report filed 5 years ago had been buried to protect a timeline, and that the 2 men who refused to let it stay buried likely kept the building from a catastrophic failure. Gary stood near the back, reddening under the applause, looking like a man unused to being thanked out loud. Afterwards, in the quiet of her office, she and Adam finally talked with nothing left unsaid between them, not the careful, circling conversations of 2 people protecting themselves, but the plain kind that comes only after the hardest part is behind you. I should have told you sooner about all of it, the building, Roy, my old life. I kept telling myself I was protecting you. I think I was mostly protecting myself. I should have asked sooner. I let the not knowing feel safer than it was, because asking meant I already cared enough for the answer to matter.
What happens to Gary? He keeps his pension, and I have asked him to take a new title, Head of Structural Safety Review for every Prescott property. He earned it about 5 years too late, but I intend to make up the difference. She paused. What about you? Any interest in consulting? I hear there's an opening. I fix furniture now, Hannah. You fix furniture beautifully. You could also stop pretending that's the only thing you're good at. He looked at her a long moment, weighing something he'd carried 5 years, without letting himself name it. Let me think about it. I've got a daughter who likes her having her father home for dinner, and I'm not interested in trading that back for a corner office. Nobody's asking you to. There's room for both if you want it. She looked at him a long moment, too. For what it's worth, Megan's taking full credit for all of this. Adam almost laughed. She dared me to ask you out. She didn't dare me to fall for you. No, Hannah said. That part we did on our own. 2 months later, the Riverwalk Exchange reopened on a clear October evening, the reinforced east wall hidden behind new brick, the rooftop crowded with lanterns and the easy conversation that comes when a city trusts a building again. Gary stood near the entrance in a suit that didn't quite fit, accepting handshakes he clearly hadn't expected, looking for once like a man with nothing left to carry alone. A reporter from the local paper asked how it felt to be called a hero, and he laughed and said he'd settle for being called honest. 20 years too late was still better than never. Ellie ran along the riverfront railing with Megan chasing half a step behind, both of them laughing at something no one else had heard. String lights swang overhead the way they had the night this whole thing started. Ellie had a new joke about her father's job that she'd been saving all week, something about how he used to build whole buildings and now he just fixed one chair at a time, and she delivered it to anyone who'd listen, delighted with herself. Adam and Hannah stood near the water, not far from where Megan had said the words that started it all, watching the crowd without needing to say much. At some point he reached over and took her hand, an ordinary gesture that had taken 5 months, 1 buried report, and 1 honest conversation to become possible. Any regrets? Hannah asked, watching a lantern sway against the dark water. Adam thought about the wife he'd lost, the career he'd walked away from, grieving, the 5 years he'd spent building furniture instead of buildings, and telling himself that was enough. He thought about how none of that had actually ended. It had just been waiting, the way the crack in that wall had been waiting for someone willing to look at it honestly. He'd taken the consulting position after all, part-time enough to keep a hand in both worlds without losing either one. No, he said, none of it.
Nearby, Megan called Hannah's eye and mouthed something that looked suspiciously like, "Told you so." Hannah rolled her eyes and didn't argue the point. Ellie ran back over breathless and tugged on her father's sleeve until he crouched to her level. "Can Hannah come to my birthday party?" she asked, as though it were the most obvious question in the world. Adam glanced up at Hannah, who was already nodding before he could answer for her. "Wouldn't miss it," Hannah said, and Ellie beamed and ran back to Megan, the matter apparently settled for good. They had never planned for any of this, not the dare, not the report, not each other. But when the truth finally came into the open, neither one of them looked for a reason to walk away.